Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome back to the Stars Forum annual conference. And we have today a good number of people who are probably interested in technology and how technology is being used in the development sector. But before we start the session for today, let me spend a few minutes introducing Stars Forum to those who have not yet interacted with us. Uh, by the way, my name is Chaitanya Nadkarni. I am the executive director of Stars Forum and have been associated with Stars Forum for the past 6 years, initially as a speaker and then as a member of the organizing committee and then also as an executive director of the organization. Stars Forum is, as the name says, it's a forum. The idea of creating the Stars, this organization, was to bring together all the wonderful work that's actually happening across the country in the rural development space, particularly those that are working on development using knowledge, science, technology, education, skills, entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on. And the idea of doing this forum and bringing people together is that there's so much that we can learn from one another. Like there's a saying which says, proverb that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together with people. So this, and on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis, we are working alone in our organization and so on. But the forum and the conference is a time when we all get together, share knowledge, experiences, best practices, and so on, so that we can learn and collaborate. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's the basic focus of the Stars Forum. So I welcome you back to today's session. Today, we are focusing on a topic which has become fairly interesting, particularly in the COVID times. But in the last several years, we are starting to see that development and people in the ecosystem of development are starting to use technology in a very big way. Um, and things which were sort of on the horizon are starting to become mainstream as well. So, what we are doing today is we are going to look at three different topics, all connected under this overall the umbrella of how software and technology is playing an important role in the development space. And we have today three world class speakers. They may not call them world class or whatever, but having spent 30 years in technology myself, I know each one of them is as good as you get anywhere in the world today. So I think we are extremely fortunate that we have highly respected, highly credible, highly experienced people who have done some fabulous work in technology and are thinking about how technology can be used in human development, in social progress, and so on and so forth. So, with that, I would like to before we start, just a few house rules before we do that. One is that we are not going to use the chat box, the chat window. So whatever questions you have, please post it in the Q&A box. That helps us manage and manage the Q&A sessions better. Uh, as soon as the speaker has finished his presentation, we will have a conversation with the speaker using the questions that you would have asked in the chat in the question and answer box. So we'll make sure that we'll do that. We have disabled the raise hand feature as well because it creates confusion and we lose time and so on. So the main way for all of us to interact with the speakers is to type in your question in the Q&A box. Let's do that clearly. We may or may not get time to answer all the questions. We have three speakers, each speaker has half an hour. So we're trying to make sure that we stick to time. So if there are any questions that do not get answers, we will make sure that we will talk with the speaker separately and we will get those answers sent to all of us later on as well. So even if you ask a question and it remains unanswered, please don't worry. We will track them. We will get those answers for you. This is regarding the house rules. And uh, and before we hand over before I hand over and invite the first speaker, I just want to make sure that all of us recognize that this is also an opportunity to associate yourself with Stars Forum. uh, we would love to invite you and become affiliate members of Stars. We don't. The membership is not a paid membership or anything of that sort. This is a network of peers, and when you register with the forum, we have good information about you, what are the kind of things you are doing, what are the kind of things that people can benefit from your experience, and so on. So it helps others as well to know you better when you uh, become an affiliate member, and give us some of your the information about your organization. So please write to us on starsforumindia at gmail.com, and we will be happy to add you to our affiliate member database as well. So with that, I would like to start off today, and I want to invite the first speaker. Or rather, let me do one thing. Let me talk about the very quickly what the three topics are. First, we're going to talk about the role of data in governance. Uh, Many years back, governments across the globe started making public the data that they have, and today, as citizens, we have access to that. How can we make use of it? Who's doing what? So Gaurav Godhwani is going to talk about that. He's going to bring stories about social change, local governance, and so on using open data. Then we have a very important topic called, in technology terms, it is also touted as one big revolution, and it's called blockchain. And we have Pratap Tambe, who's going to be speaking about blockchain. He's going to try and tell us what is blockchain all about. What is A lot of people are talking about blockchain. What is it in the? So we're going to get an introduction to that. Tomorrow we have a little bit more about blockchain, where we see an actual usage of blockchain in a few of the development sectors. But today we'll get an introduction to blockchain. And the third topic for today, which Vinay is going to speak about, is as organizations, we need to sometimes decide whether we want to build software or buy whatever is there off the shelf. What does one do? These are not simple decisions. How do you think about making that decision? So this is what Vinay is going to talk about. So three different topics, some of which are informational, some of which are going to help us make decisions, and so on and so forth. So with that, I would like to invite Gaurav Godhwani to kick off for today. Um, a little bit about Gaurav before I hand it over to him. Gaurav is a co-founder and director of an organization known as the Civic Data Lab. They're based in Indore. It's a research lab harnessing data, technology, design, and social science to strengthen the course of civic engagements in India. Gaurav works to leverage the open source movement to enable citizens in engaging better with public reforms as well. Gaurav and his team works closely with several governments in India, state governments, central governments, non-profits, think tanks, media houses, universities to help them enable making decisions using data. He has been instrumental in setting some important initiatives in India many years back called DataKind, and then open budgets as well. And he's focused on developing or growing the open data innovations in sectors such as public finance, law and justice, urban planning, and more. So with that, I would like to invite you, Gaurav. Gaurav, stage is yours.
Thanks a lot, Chaitanya. Just doing a quick mic check. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. I would just share my screen and it go. Great. So thanks a lot, Chaitanya, for inviting me to the Stars Forum. This is very exciting. I really like the work Stars Forum has been doing in terms of improving livelihoods, improving rural innovations, and improving knowledge sharing in this network. Today, I'm going to talk about something which is very close to my heart: how data can play a vital role in social change. And I'm going to share some stories from the work we have been doing at Civic Data Lab with our partners across India. So I will just quickly dive into what we have been hearing across in the data ecosystem. We have been hearing that data is the new oil. Cleve Humby quoted this a couple of years back. Like oil, it needs some refinement. It can empower different economies. It can power different forms of fuels, which can take us from one place to the other. So that's what data has been thought through as a new oil. We are also hearing from some other segment of people that data is not just a new oil. Data is actually the new soil. The possibilities with the soil are endless. You can grow so many things. You can grow so many new innovations, and you can derive so many new things out of soil. So that's what David McCandless quoted few years back. But in my humble opinion, what data is in India, especially in social sector, is this: data is locked, data is not consumable, data is not reusable. Anytime we try to work with our local governments to understand where taxpayers' money is going, we end up facing the same issues. Anytime we try to go with the check with our local authorities to see what's the state of crime in my geography, we go into the same issues. Anytime I try to work with the elected representatives to see how the beneficiary schemes are being implemented in the country, go into the same issues. Data is mostly locked, or it's not consumable, or it's not reusable. It comes in myriad formats. Sometimes you file an RTI, you get bunch of printed documents, and you have to pay 2 to 5 rupees per page to access all that information. In Indore Municipal Corporation is where I live, and when I filed an RTI to get budget information from Indore, I got these big bundles of printed documents from the municipal corporation, and all of them were just scanned copies of budget statements, what they have been doing for last 3 to 4 years. Imagine you have to go through all those bundles of document to make sense of how much money is exactly going into Swachh Bharat in my ward, how much money is exactly going into clean energy. Those are the kind of issues we face with the data at the moment. What data ideally should be needs to be freely accessible, especially public data, data for which we are paying money for. Data should be clean and usable so that others can find the same kind of value as we derive from it. And data needs to be open so that whatever experiments you are doing with data, others can learn from you, others can freely use it, others uh, can derive different forms of it. All those things are possible when data is open, it's clean and usable, and it's freely accessible for all the citizens. And that's something where Civic Data Labs comes in. We work to create more open data sources, more open data platforms. As Chaitanya very well summarized, the kind of work we have been doing for last couple of years, try to increase civic engagements in the country. Specifically, two kinds of civic engagements. One, how do we improve access to good information, timely information for most of our citizens? At least citizens who have internet access, can they get timely, reusable, useful information within just few clicks on their search box? Other other kind of civic engagement platform or opportunity we have is, once they have this access to crucial information, how they can meaningfully participate with the governance happening in their geography, be it participating in the governance of national government, state governments, local municipal corporations, or maybe other governmental authorities, even participating well with civil society organizations, NGOs, think tanks, entrepreneurs in their region, is what we are looking for. And that's how we have started Civic Data Lab with the mission to connect data, tech, design, and social science. As Chaitanya mentioned, we work in three sectors at the moment: public finance, law and justice, and urban development. We try to create open data platforms in all three of them, and we are trying to see how we can engage more citizens with timely information in these sectors. So today I would talk about a bit about budgets to begin with, and then gradually go to other kind of data sets which are out there. So in India, when you're trying to understand what's behind the budget speech, when a finance minister give their uh, 1 to 2 hours long speech about how India is going to spend crores amount of money in a particular financial year, you have to go through close to 150 kind of budget documents, and these are just the varieties. When you go to the numbers of document, they easily cost thousands and thousands just for one financial year. You have to go through the national government's budget data, you have to go to your state government's budget data, and you also need to go through treasury information as well as local municipal corporation or council's data to get a complete sense of where the money is flowing in the country. And even that sense is not exactly complete. That also give you only certain percentage of information of what is happening out there. To make life slightly simple for you as a citizen, what we have done is we have built a platform known as Open Beds India, which is a community-driven open data platform where we are hosting all this information on a timely basis at one place. We try to convert some of these data sets into Excels so that you can explore this without going to print them, without going through thousands of PDFs, without going through the scanned documents. We give APIs so that governments can use this APIs to derive more meaningful information. Private agencies can also leverage these APIs to create appropriate business decisions based on budget data, and so on. We also create simple tools for citizens to explore this information much faster in a much visually appealing way. So that's what the platform is all about. You can go and check it out at openbedsindia.org. That's the URL. And I would be sharing slides at the end as well. So please don't worry if you haven't noted down anything. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. Exploratory tools like this helps you understand where the union budget money is flowing from one section where the revenue side is, another section where the expenditure side is. You can see all of that in a very interactive manner at one place. So that brings me to the first story which I want to discuss with you today. It's about how open data is seeding new collaborations, especially in the state of Assam. So Assam State Finance Department took a World Bank loan of certain $1 million in early 2017 to improve financial reforms in the state. Around the same time, our platform OpenBudge India went live, and as part of our advocacy efforts, we reached out to the finance department there, saying that we would help you open up some of the information you're sitting on. We would help build capacity for you. We would help your staff members understand the data much better and find ways in which citizens can collaborate. In exchange of all of this, we only ask you to share your data in open formats so that more citizens, more research groups, more organizations and interested people can utilize that data and drive their own analysis. And they agreed. We reached out to all other states as well, but Assam was the first one who agreed to the proposal we sent to them. And they also agreed to engage more people with the budget. So every year they put together participatory budgeting practices where they seek information from citizens on what they would like to see in the next year's budget. They also see they also seek what kind of changes they would like to see in the different departments, different districts citizens are based on. So this year, this financial year 2021, we thought we would collaborate with youth volunteers through Assam and NCC camps, UNICEF Assam and NCC camps, and reach out to much wider group of people on seeking their budget suggestions, especially on youth-related topics like job opportunity, better educational institutions, clean environment, youth participation, and so on. And thankfully, thousands of youth volunteers responded what they would like in this year's budget. They also participated in their academic institutions to go through the previous years of budget data and come up with specific points for the finance department to improve upon. And we collated all that information and presented back to the finance department, sharing that this is what youth volunteers are interested in. Please take take a look at it and make decisions for this financial year. Uh, Similarly, civil society organizations, apart from youth volunteers, started to engage with the budget data. I would talk about one small organization which is based out of Guwahati, Assam, known as Studio Nilima. What they are trying to do is they are trying to see how correctional homes, which is mostly prison facilities in Assam, are doing at the moment. Is there good health and well-being for inmates in different prisons? They are close to 50 prisons in Assam. Looking into what kind of diet they are being served, looking into what kind of facilities are available for women and transgender inmates in the jails of Assam. So one specific use case or one specific question they had is, are the Assam correctional homes well equipped to fight the COVID-19 pandemic? And this is something they started raising as soon as the lockdown started to happen in Assam and other parts of the country. And to demystify this, what we did is we analyzed diet related data, budget data of jails of last couple of years, and started to look how much of the budget is being utilized. So if you see red bars, all the red bars are the proposed budget by the finance minister of Assam. The yellow one is the revisions. Revisions are a provision for the finance departments to revise them mid-year using supplementary grant processes and other fiscal reforms. And blue one is the actual amount which auditors validate that this much spending happened for this particular use case, which is being documented in the budget. So if you see constantly, the blue bars are much, much higher than the red bars for last couple of years. So what it says is Assam is under budgeting when it comes to diet related budget for Assam district jails. And this is happening constantly for last 4 years. So what we're trying to do with this data and the research work which Studio Nilima has done in Guwahati, Assam, is to reach out to the finance department and reach out to the jails department, which comes under the home department, to see how can we increase the budget allocation so that jails don't feel that they don't have enough money to take care of the diet plans of inmates in Assam. So that's the kind of advocacy we are trying to do with the government, which is very specific to different use cases. This is just one such example. With this data, you can find different insights, be it in the agriculture space, be it in the health space, education, so on. Wherever government money is flowing, you can draw similar analysis and work with the local groups to reach out to the government and see how we can improve budget allocations for that particular sector or use case you're trying to work on. And thankfully, governments like Assam are open for those sort of collaborations. They're quite open and reachable in terms of these sort of queries and suggestions. So it's up to us now as citizens that how much we use that opportunity to work closely with the government. Now, in interest of time, I would bring you to the second interesting use case, which we have seen in Madhya Pradesh state, where I spend most of my time, in these demystifying local issues. So we worked with a Bhopal-based small litigation legal research organization known as Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project. And their interest was, how is policing happening in time of COVID in Madhya Pradesh? What kind of arrests are happening? What kind of FIRs being lodged? What kind of policing processes are being taken under to keep citizens in check during this process. So what we did is we looked into the complaints portal, the Nagrik portal of Madhya Pradesh, where we see arrest data, which is collected almost on a regular basis from all the police stations. We also see some of the FIRs related to this information, related to these arrests. The challenge is all of it is hidden under complicated websites. So we work with them something which you can open for exploration, and then work with them to use this data to find certain insights. So their researchers spent a couple of days to see what are the policing patterns happening in different districts in Madhya Pradesh. And what we found was very interesting. We found that a lot of street vendors were being arrested, and these street vendors were being arrested because they were selling fruits and vegetables during the time of pandemic. Most of these street vendors, close to 69% of them, were selling essential goods. Still, they were being arrested and put in jails during the pandemic. Even same was the case with shopkeepers and milk sellers, small dairy shops. 46% of them were selling essential goods, uh, and they were being arrested in Madhya Pradesh. So, which is a striking observation, something which we didn't think would be happening during the COVID lockdowns. Similarly, when we digged further, we thought let's go and see what are these kind of street vendors which are getting arrested. So 55% of them were selling stuff on street carts, and mostly essential goods which were getting arrested. Uh, and out of those, only 32% were causing crowds and and were causing community of people to come together in the cart. While less than 9% were selling in the containment zone or no permit zone. Rest uh, close to 91% of the street vendors were not even selling in the containment zone. So those are the kind of insights. Similarly, you can see for shopkeepers and milk sellers, 12% of their supplies were confiscated by the police, and small kirana shops, small dairy farms, they serve a lot of economic
Hello, Gaurav. Looks like Gaurav's
Yeah, Gaurav's connection
connection.
is lost, I guess.
We'll just wait for 10, 15 seconds, and then hopefully he should be able to join us. So meanwhile, there are a few questions that have come in. I think maybe we can take one or two. There's a question about what are the problems with open and freely accessible data? Where are the boundaries? I'm not too comfortable sharing personal information such as bank and health details and so on. So I think this is absolutely right. When it comes to data, there is this tug of war between the government and the rest of us, if you will. The government wants to know a lot more about us than we are comfortable sharing with the governments, and I think that tug of war will remain for some time. It's it, we know that this is we'll have to fight hard to uh, ensure privacy of information and access and controls and so on and so forth. Health information is very, very crucial. Uh, we've had issues initially in the early days when India also started opening up and so on. There were concerns about data. When the Arogya Setu app was launched many months back to keep a watch on the COVID situation, there were a lot of people who were concerned about the privacy of the information that the app was capturing. And we will later there were revelations that yes, there were some issues about that. So these issues are always, there's always going to be it's some of them are like what Pramod Khadilkar said yesterday. Not all of those are straightforward answers. And we might have situations where uh, there is some conflict between what the public would like to share versus what the government wants to know. So those things are very clear. I think Subodh Kulkarni is talking about. He seems to be working with data, and maybe Subodh, it will be good if you and Gaurav and his team connected to see what how you all can collaborate on some of the things that you've got there. Yeah, welcome back, Gaurav. I think we lost you for a little bit.
Yeah, can you tell me where did you lose me?
You were on the slide I think you were talking about the Madhya Pradesh policing data.
Right. Uh, if we have 4 or 5 minutes, I can quickly finish that.
Yeah, I think we should. And then there are a few questions, but yeah, I think if you can sort of start wrapping up, it might help us
Sure.
get into a conversation with you.
Sure. May I request your team to share the screen? I think I've been having some issue. I've shared the presentation with you as well as other team members. Chaitanya, you are on mute.
I was saying that you can continue speaking while I get the presentation on.
Yeah. So just quickly wrapping up, the third story is more on. Just finishing the Madhya Pradesh one. So we also found what kind of patterns in terms of pedestrian-related arrests were happening. People who were not wearing masks, or people were roaming in public places, were getting arrested. But 39% of FIRs were for pedestrians and were for people selling in upmarket, uh, in vegetable markets rather than upmarket grocery stores. So if we can go a couple of slides next.
Is it okay?
Yeah, if we can go Bhakti, couple of slides more next. Yeah, this should be fine.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I think third story is from Himachal Pradesh, where we started to look into what kind of public procurements are happening in the state, especially related to health and water and sanitations for last couple of years to build good infrastructure. And what interesting insights we got is each district is performing quite differently from other. So Bhakti, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so most of the tender information is stuck in some of these forms like this. There you would have certain information after entering a CAPTCHA, you would be able to get that, and you would be able to read a particular tender in a couple of seconds rather than downloading all of data in a short time frame. Bhakti, I think we lost your screen, but anyway, I would just quickly talk about it. So we collected all that information. We used all the procurement information there just to see how internal efficiency of different districts have been in Himachal Pradesh in terms of the tendering time, in terms of ensuring that enough bids are coming for those public tenders, in terms of market competitiveness and so on, and value for money, whether the goods or the infrastructure which was being procured was worth the money or not. And we found some patterns which we are working with the district officials to see how we can fix them. And what we hope with all of this process, we would be able to generate more market opportunities for local entrepreneurs to participate better with the government officials, apply more for these public procurements, and help deliver much robust services, infrastructure, and goods in the state of Himachal Pradesh. So that's where I would end. Bhakti, if you can go to the last slide, these are some insights, but this is where you can find all of it. This is the QR code, that's the URL, and that's our email address to reach out to us to discuss all of it in much more detail. So thanks a lot, and sorry for all the internet issues. Extremely sorry for that.
No problem, Gaurav. Thank you so much for the presentation. While you were reconnecting, we did take a few questions, and there was one question about the openness of data, the privacy, personal data, and so on. And from my little exposure, I was saying that this tug of war continues to be fought all around the globe.
Right.
Governments want your information and we want to hold it back. Any particular view on your point? I think there are a couple of interesting questions that I want to really seek your answers on.
Sure.
But yeah, so there's one question about looking at the diet expenditure kind of question that was there, is that we have information, but how do we, is there a way to find out the quality of the service, quality of the diet that was being provided? So is, there are those aspects, is there a way to get to that as well?
Right. So I can try answering both of them
Yeah,
together.
sure,
Uh,
sure.
the privacy aspect is very much quite important, and most of the open data practitioners are of the belief that information should be aggregated and then shared in public domain, or information should be anonymized and shared in the public domain. Names of the individuals, addresses of the individuals, uh, mobile numbers, and other personally identified information shouldn't be shared. And that's what we are seeing with across the globe with GDPR, and in India with Personal Data Protection Bill, that more laws would become stricter around what kind of information related to personally identified fields could be shared in public domain. Uh, what we are trying to do is we work with our partners to make them realize that while individual information is essential, but that's essential for the beneficiary. So the beneficiary should have the right to access their information, not an organization or not someone else, until unless they give authority or a sort of a consent to them to access that thing. But unfortunately, most of the government platforms at the moment are leaking this personal information. We try to write to them so that this sort of information is curbed to some extent. At the same time, essential information is shared so that research and participation doesn't get stopped.
Yeah.
The second part on the quality of information, I think it's a tricky one. At this point where we get anyway very less information, we believe whatever we can get is quite essential, quite handy. And with some limited information, we can go and request much more when we start seeing gaps. So a lot of people take some public data and then go ahead and conduct surveys on ground with help of activist groups, with help of volunteers, to validate how much of it is making sense.
Mm,
And when you join those data sets together, you get sort of a complete picture.
mm,
While
mm.
we help on the first part, we are also strategizing how we can help more and more organizations to create better data surveys, better data collection mechanisms on ground.
Yeah, yeah. I think there are a couple of questions. Hopefully, at the end we may have some time to
Sure.
talk about it. But thank you so much, Gaurav. I think this the work that you are doing, and the work of open data and public data scrutiny and use is going to become that much more important for us as citizens to keep a watch on how our governments are doing, uh, and actually to use that data to point to areas where we see uh, improvement possibilities, improvement gaps, and so on. Not necessarily as in an opposing ways, but to
Correct.
try and bring it together. Otherwise, we are always on the wrong ends of the spectrum. So I think your experience of trying to use data to help improve governance and bring citizens and governments together is a very, very important initiative. Not too many people are doing that, and I'm happy that we had the opportunity to have you and talk to us about what your early experiences have been. So thank you so much once again, and we would love to remain in touch. I think a few of our attendees have specific things they may reach out to you and talk to you about
Sure.
stuff as well. Okay.
Sure.
With
Thanks a
that, I
lot.
would thanks you. Thank you so much. Hang on, we might get questions at the end if you allow.
Sure.
So with that, I think I would like to invite our second speaker, Pratap Tambe. Pratap, I hope you're all set.
Yes, I'm all set.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Pratap. I want to very brief introduction about Pratap. Pratap, I've known him since almost 20 years now, and Pratap is one of the leading experts on blockchain today. Um, and But he's a very interesting person, not just a technologist, but also a deeply sensitive, deeply empathetic human being, very particularly interested in social justice and equity. Pratap is a IIT Bombay graduate, did his master's from Institute of Science, Bangalore, 25 plus years in IT experience. He's been living in the UK now since 2005, and he's probably the first globally to describe how blockchains can be applied to transform the global insurance business. And he's now, after having proposed that, he's actually leading the transformation as well. He's written a couple of research papers, very interestingly, on how modern slavery can be reduced using artificial intelligence and blockchain. And he's working to actually bring them to life as well. Pratap is very critical about the Aadhaar ecosystem and the current generation of electronic voting systems as well. And but he's doing something about it. He's actually keen to build representative participation systems as well that can actually give a better alternative to us in citizens and so on. So, with that, I would like to sort of hand over to Pratap. Please walk us through what is this blockchain? ये blockchain क्या है? थोड़ा बताइए हमें.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Just a sec. Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with a small thought experiment. If I give you a 5 GBP note, how will you decide whether to accept it or not? So if you go to the UK Central Bank website, there are some methods described how you validate a physical note. In India also we have similar equivalents. You basically see through the window and the portrait of the Queen, see if the Big Ben is gold on the front of the note and silver on the black. So these are actually instructions to validate whether a physical note given to you is correct or not. So you'll use this kind of a mechanism to validate whether it is a trustworthy note, before you put your trust and provide a service against that 5 GBP. But if I send you a image of a 5 GBP note, to your email address, will you accept it? Typically you won't, because there is some intuitive reason why you won't. But if you log into your bank account, using your computer or phone, and you see 5 GBP credit there, you trust it. So why do you trust basically the 5 GBP in your bank account, but you don't trust the thing which arrived in your email? That is a very important question. So this is where basically the whole idea about blockchain comes in. The whole point is everybody knows that anybody can make a copy of that digital image, and you can have as many copies of it floating around on the internet, and that is why you don't trust it. Because you can if I give £5 to you, then it doesn't mean that I have spent my £5. I could very well make a copy and give it to you. So that is the primary reason why you don't trust the that email image which arrives in your email. But the money that you see in the bank, now banks, basically there is a whole system, of there is a central bank in the and there is a system of accounting by which by all the transfers in each of these banks are reconciled, and we trust that this reconciliation ensures that whatever you see in that 5 GBP credit in your bank account, that is trustworthy. So this is the most important thing to understand, that basically you trust what appears in your bank account, but you don't trust the thing in the email image. So it's just imagine if we could make that email image currency trustworthy, what would be involved. So this is what blockchain does. So in blockchain creates trust about digital information. The mechanism of by which the 5 GBP in your bank account becomes trustworthy is a complex system of accounting and reconciliations which is done, and that is very expensive. This method that the banks use is extremely expensive, and it's very brittle. It's very flaky. If it's something that creates a lot of cost. But Bitcoin is a mechanism by which people send money to each other without needing a central third party. In the banking system, you have the central bank, you have a network of banks, and they have this mechanism. But in Bitcoin or in blockchain, you don't need a central third party. So that is the whole value of blockchain. It is by transferring, enables people to trust digital information, and this currency is just an example. Bitcoin is just an example. So let's talk about how can we potentially make this email image currency. First issue is, when somebody transfers basically money using that email image, then how do we ensure that the new transfer transaction is trustworthy? If I transfer some money to you, 5 GBP to you, so how do we ensure that this new transfer has integrity? One of the things we have to make sure is that do I actually own the £5 which I'm going to transfer to you? Is the ownership title clear? That is the first question. How does one make sure of that digitally? Once you have made sure of that, then you have to make sure that is the person who is sending me this currency actually the owner of this currency? Is he? You have to verify whether that person is who he or she claims to be. And basically the transaction details that are being submitted, they have not been modified before when that person sent it and I received it. So you have to ensure that the ownership title is clear, and whether basically the person who is sending is a genuine person, is allowed to send, and basically he owns the money, and nobody has in between basically modified that thing that has been sent. So that is what the most important thing. But there is one more thing, that how do we ensure the integrity of the transaction history? Right? Transaction history means whatever, when you go to your bank account, how do we make sure that whatever past history is there is correct? Because by changing the past history, you could potentially create new change the balance that you have in your account. So how do you have to make sure, did the transaction that is shown in the past, did it happen at all, and did the transaction details change? So these are the things which need to be done to make the email image, that if I sent an image in your email, to make it trustworthy. So these are the kind of things that blockchain does, and therefore blockchain ensures that it makes digital information trustworthy. So for example, if you wanted to send a report to 5 different people, right, and how blockchain, and you wanted to make sure that nobody modifies it on the way, and it's exactly the report, everybody is reading exactly the report that you had sent. So you need, if you wanted to people to be able to trust that you have sent this, you are the person who have sent it, then you need things like this. So this is not only about currency or money transfer, it is generally about digital information. How does one make digital information trustworthy? So this is the real foundation of blockchain. Now, to understand this blockchain stuff, there is as you have to understand firstly something called digital signature. A digital signature is based on some mathematics about public key and private key cryptography. So I won't go into the deep mathematics of it, but fundamentally it is a set of mathematics which enables, if I have, everybody has their own public key and private key. So everybody generates a public key and private key, and if I send you a message which is encrypted using my public key, my private key, then you will be able to decrypt it using my public key. And if you are able to do that, because I can give everybody my public key, and I can send them messages using my encrypted using my private key. Then if they are able to decrypt it using my public key and get the message, then they know that it has definitely come from me. And vice versa. If they were to send me similar messages, then I will use their public key to decrypt it. And if I'm able to do that, then basically I can be sure that that has been sent by the person whose public key this is. So this is called public key public key cryptography. And you can basically use this kind of keys to generate digital signatures. So basically, the mechanism by which this blockchain type of thing works, we'll get into that. But this is an important concept. So you can use this private key to sign a message. So when you use it to sign a message, you generate, you process the message using these keys, and you generate, you basically generate something called a hash. Now, and if you send the hash, then you can use that hash to verify whether who has sent the message, and that it has not been modified. So these are two important concepts to understand understand blockchain better. First thing is public key cryptography, private key, public key, using which it becomes possible to verify who has sent a particular message, right? So it is the method used to authenticate that person, who has sent this message. And secondly, the digital signature is also used to encrypt a message, to basically ensure that the message has not been modified. So these are two important concepts. So now let's see how blockchain, what is blockchain, and we will come back to this two concepts that I explained with some to talk about it. So blockchain is basically a peer-to-peer network maintaining a distributed database. We all use the internet. So in the internet, we send a message we send a transaction to the browser. The browser basically, we use a browser, we could go to a URL, a form loads on our screen, we fill out the form, and that form, when you press enter, that browser generates a transaction and sends it to the server. The server receives the transaction, interprets what's there in the form, validates all of that, and if it is valid, then it saves it on the server. So this is what we are all familiar with. The main thing in blockchain is that when the browser sends a same thing happens. When you go to a URL, you download the form comes to your screen, or your browser screen. You fill out the form, and then you press enter. That transaction is sent to multiple different servers in parallel, right? And so there is a multiple servers in parallel, and we'll go into this in slightly more detail. But there are multiple servers, they are doing, and each node can send transactions. That's the whole idea. So they are equivalent to each other. So each node can propose transactions, and various nodes can evaluate transactions. So it's a peer-to-peer network, and each node keeps a copy of the database. So normally we send, we are used to a client server kind of environment, where typically the database is stored on the server. But here basically each node has its own database, and so that's how it works. And so there is a peer-to-peer network. They maintain a distributed database. Each node has its own copy, and they basically they have rules about who can submit a transaction, who can participate in when the browser sends a transaction, each node evaluates that transaction. And if after evaluating the transactions, they go through a process called the consensus process, which is basically comparing whether do you agree that it is valid type of thing. And if everybody agrees that it is valid, or the majority agrees that it is valid, then it is stored. Then it is stored. And when it is stored in a manner such that it cannot be modified. And there is some detail to that. It is stored in a link, in a linked list of blocks. Basically, it's a chain of blocks, and that is where the name comes from. So these are some of the important concepts. So fundamentally, in normal internet is about sending a browser sending to one server. Here, your browser is sending to multiple servers, and each server does the validation. Let's go to the next slide there. So basically, what I'm saying is, in blockchain, a browser submits a transaction to a group of servers. Then each server validates. What does it validate? Is the server is the submitter of this transaction who he claims to be, and is he permitted to submit transactions? So that is, every server does that. And then they also check, is the transaction valid with respect to the history and the current situation? Now, this history thing is a very important thing. So if, for example, you don't own a house, you can't transfer a house. And whether you have a house depends on the previous sequence of transactions establishing your ownership. So like, if you have ever tried to sell a house, then, the government mechanism will check, that chain of agreements and so on. So, that is the important chain, that's the equivalent of the chain that's the history that we are talking about. And then when each transaction has similarly validated, then each server has similarly validated, they go through something called the consensus process. Consensus is essentially you could say they have a vote, and if the majority agrees that it is all valid, then basically they have reached consensus. There are various types of consensus algorithms, and there are complexities related to that, but we'll not go into that. That's not too relevant for this group. And then if they reach consensus, then basically they store it by appending to a chain of blocks. This chain of blocks is organized in such a manner that to change any block, you need to have changed the block before it, and you can't change that block until you change the block before it. So the whole chain of blocks can only be modified if more than 51% of the more than the majority were to agree, let's change all the blocks. Otherwise, a minority cannot change the blocks. That's how the algorithms and the system has been designed. So because of this, there are a lot of properties. It becomes practically immutable. It becomes practically impossible that once a transaction has been done, then it cannot be modified. So this is this is the core thing to understand about blockchain. It is very similar to our browser sending things to a server, and the server validating thing and serving, which is the natural experience we have had for the last 25 years. This primarily is you're sending to multiple servers and they going through this process. That's the primary difference here. But there are a few characteristics that blockchain has which give it a lot of value, right? So with respect to this example that I gave, I will now talk about this. So there are smart, we are able to do all of this without needing a third party. So that's what in the banking example that I talked about, there's a whole network of banks and they're doing reconciliation and all. We are doing this without needing a third party, a human being in between. So that is one. Then immutability, because because it is stored in the chain of blocks and things cannot be modified in the history. That's why it's immutable. Then near real-time settlement. Now the important thing is that everybody has seen the transaction, does the validation before it is saved. Normally what happens in other systems is that you first save it, and then basically everybody tries to see, did you save, there is a reconciliation, whether each bank in that network has done the right thing. So they have to do reconciliation to check whether everything has happened correctly. Here all the parties are processing the transaction, are viewing the transaction before it is saved. All the servers are doing this here. In the normal banking system, each server does things independently, and then they do reconciliation to make sure everybody has done it correctly. Here all servers are seeing it before. So that is what near time settlement is. And then because there is a combined, there's this immutable history, so that forms a single source of truth. So these are the core properties: disintermediation, immutability, near real-time settlement, and single source of truth. There are two advanced properties. I talked about validation and processing that happens at each node. So you submit a transaction, each server evaluates that. Now, suppose you were to send a PDF document as part of the transaction to the server. Now, if that PDF document, each server basically has a human being sitting there, beside it, and he were to interpret whatever was written and do something, then what will happen is that despite 5 different people processing that, they would all interpret the document differently and have different interpretations of it. So one may think it's valid, the other may say it's not valid, and so on and so forth. So there is a risk that basically whatever data you submit to the browser may be interpreted differently and cause problems. So therefore, this concept of smart contracts comes in, where everybody basically, it's a program, it's like a stored procedure or whatever. So everybody you have a program which does the validation, and everybody has the same copy of that program, and therefore there is common interpretation. So this is one of the most important properties of blockchain. There is no other technology which can ensure that a whole group of server people process a transaction exactly the same way. There's no other way technology, and this is what generates lots of efficiencies. So it reduces costs tremendously. In the insurance sector, it is reducing cost by 30%. 30% cost is reduced. That's a significant number. So this is one of the other one important advanced properties. And it's we'll talk more about that. Then the next important property is automate and exponentiate trust. So if you have learned to do one set of transactions with one set of servers, you have built something which can be extended. You can add more transactions and more servers to do for example, if you have learned to do mortgage and loans with one set of servers, you have built something, then you can extend that to a new set of servers to do other things as well, trading or whatever, more easily. So that's what is called automate. You can automate the trust, and then you can exponentiate it. So these are some of the characteristics which give blockchain its value. So let's talk about some of the types of use cases. Now, for example, blockchain is the only technology which can be used to automate process across enterprises. This is very important. There is no other technology which can automate process across enterprises unless you have a centralized third party. And unless you decide that all of us will trust this guy, and we will send him his data, he'll process it for us and whatever. If without a centralized third party, there is no other way of automating a process without blockchain. Then if there is a situation where multiple different data is coming from different parties, and you want to create a near real-time view of that data, then blockchain is a very good tool for that. And some people may be adding, deleting, whatever, and you want to create a consolidated, constant real-time view. Blockchain is a very good technology. And then system security. Most of the security systems in the world currently are about username password databases, and that creates a honeypot of data, and that creates cyber risk, because people can go and invade such things and steal that data or so on. Then but in the blockchain system security, self-sovereign identity, that's the problem with Aadhaar, the infamous Aadhaar, in my view. That's a central database, and it's if anybody raids it, then we are gone. So the blockchain system security is that everybody has their own keys. So even if somebody raids, then one person's data is lost, other people's data is not lost. So that is about the system security. That's the self-sovereign identity context. Then reducing risk and fraud. So because blockchain creates immutability, so that past history cannot be changed. So it reduces risk and fraud. And then one of the things that Chaitanya talked about is control over information. So blockchain is a technology which can give an end user control over his or her information, and he can use his own information to customize a new service. So when you go to a website, typically if you have stored its cookies, it will customize its behavior for you. But if you go to a place where you have never visited before, currently there is no way it will customize its behavior to you. But blockchain enables a mechanism by which you can store your own customizable attributes, and you can offer it to a server you have never gone to, and it will customize its behavior to you. And there are various mechanisms of generating new business models. So that's the next thing.
Pratap, maybe I don't know how much more you have, but
I'm done. This is the last slide.
a lot of people are asking about what are some of the practical things that some of the practical examples, particularly in the social sector, that you
Okay.
think you can connect this to.
Sure. I can. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'll give you an example of the thing that Chaitanya talked about. Me and my wife wrote a paper on uh, using AI and blockchain to reduce modern slavery. And I just got off a call with with a United Nations officer about it. And I'm talking to various people about this. So the way this works is, there are suppose there is a factory in Tamil Nadu or Madurai and whatever, which is basically hiring workers and getting clothes made from them. So we will have CCTV footage of that factory, and we will based on which we will be able to identify whether good working conditions are there, whether violence is being used, and so on, using AI techniques called video analytics, activity analytics, and so on. So once that is identified, then it will log an incident into the blockchain. So the blockchain will have nodes which are run by factories, and it will have nodes which are run by retailers. For example, in UK, you could have Primark and Debenhams and whatever else. And so basically, when that incident is logged, people can, and a snippet of the video will be also logged with it. And by analyzing that snippet, people can verify whether indeed modern slavery is going on. And based on that, there could be penalties for the supplier, and supplier could be sanctioned and could lose business from that retailer, etc. So this is the kind of thing that we are working on. And I am at an advanced stage of discussions regarding this, and this thing is potentially something that can be used. It does fall in some measure in the areas that NGOs work with. And there are other applications. I think tomorrow Gaurav is going to speak, so he will definitely talk about some applications related to that. I can give you a crop insurance example, which I've been discussing, because insurance is my area. And so crop insurance, there are various it is possible to uh, uh, it is possible for to have a we have this global network called B3I, which basically is you can have an application on that blockchain network, which can be used to place crop insurance policies, and which people can use. So that is that would be one example. Then the other most important use of blockchain, which would be a competition to Aadhaar, and that is something that I can talk for hours about, is as I said, Aadhaar creates a central database of all the identities. And self-sovereign digital identity is a blockchain-based identity, where each person carries his or her identity, is in control of his or her identity, and nobody else can delete their identity. Today, if somebody were to go to the Aadhaar database and delete my identity, then there is nothing I can do about it. Or if somebody were to go and but then make it difficult for make things difficult for me. So those kind of things, so that is another major application of blockchain in development. There is a lot of United Nations has done a lot of things related to this digital identities. So those are some of the applications that I can talk about.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, I think we won't have too much time left for Q&A. But I think the one thing that I'm sure most of us are sort of keen to sort of understand is how this technology is going to be actually used in the work that we are doing. And I think tomorrow's session that Gaurav Munshi is going to do, I think with Vilas Shinde will actually give us a real example of what potential some of the things that you spoke about has in the real world today. So with that, I really thank you, Pratap, for giving us an insight into a fairly complex sort of technology that this is all about. And hopefully, tomorrow's this thing we will be able to connect the theory and the practice and sort of get our heads around why we all need to start paying attention to blockchain. Okay,
Okay.
thank you so much. And with that, I think I would like to bring Vinay into the conversation now. Uh, this is the third subject for today, quite different from the first two that we spoke about, and and it's about how do organizations make, build, or buy decisions when it comes to acquiring software. This is something that corporates have to deal with, and even us within the development sector have to figure about. Well, a lot of us are used to using free tools at times, open source software at times, and so on. But how does one go about making these choices? So I think we'll be able to get a little deeper insight into this from Vinay. Vinay, I would like to use a minute to sort of introduce you to the audience today. Vinay Venu has spent a better part of his last decade building and implementing information technology products for NGOs across India. He has worked both with big and financially well-funded organizations, as well as many small NGOs trying to streamline their processes and make sense of the data that they collect through their systems and so on. Vinay works with an organization called Samanvay Research and Development Foundation. It's a technology non-profit that's based in Bangalore and works on building open source products for the development sector. Vinay's interests lie in the intersection of technology and development, and he's here today to share his learnings and perspectives of how technology from the software builder's perspective can be used. If you need a simple way to figure out if the software meets your organization or finds the best way to go somewhere else to find software, this is the talk that will help you make that build or buy decision. So over to you, Vinay.
Thanks, Chaitanya. I'll try to share my screen.
Yes, please.
Is this visible? The presentation?
We have a white screen at the moment, but maybe if you can advance the slide, we'll know. Yeah, we see the whiteboard now.
Oh.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Vinay. I work with a company, a non-profit based on Bangalore called Samanvay Foundation, as Chaitanya had mentioned. About 4 years ago, a bunch of us who used to work with a different company kind of joined together and wanted to build technology for the development sector in India. So we worked with multiple different organizations here in India, as well as abroad before before we got into Samanvay. And here, one of the things that we really like passionate about nowadays is a product called Avni, which is a community service and a data collection platform for field workers. So it works in multiple different sectors: health, education, water, livelihood, agriculture, and quite a few others. It is open source, obviously, and it's something that we're passionate about. So it also helped us to connect to a lot of NGOs around the country. And what I'm going to be talking today is our experience of talking to all these small and mid-sized NGOs who are kind of moving towards their, like taking baby steps towards moving to their digital transformation. Now, what kind of problems would you face if you were to start introducing technology to your organization? In my mind, there are basically three problems. And the first thing is that nothing is ever permanent. Second is that nothing is ever free. And the third is that the digital transformation that you're talking about is never about technology. It's mostly about just people. Given that, let me explain that a bit more. The first one, nothing is permanent. Let me explain this with like a few stories. back in 2010, I kind of started volunteering with an NGO in Delhi. Initially, when I started, I met this lady who was running the NGO, and the first thing she told me was, "You volunteers, you just come here, sit for 6 months, 10 months, and just leave, and we are here to like take up all the rest of, like, clean up the mess that you've created here." At that time, I kind of realized that any relationship that you would want to start with an NGO is going to be a lifelong kind of a relationship. At least that's the message I kind of took out of it. This was like a small mobile ambulance kind of a setup. I kind of helped here and there. I was not a medical person, so I kind of helped here and there, and then I figured that I can use my technical skills to build some kind of a software for them. Uh, so I built a small software for them, and about 6 months I was volunteering there, and then I got a job, and that was in Bangalore. So I had to relocate here. There were a few baby steps. So we had like some kind of funding things to take care of. We bought like a nice server for them. We bought like 10 laptops so that people can actually start entering data there. Now the problem is that it's running in Delhi. I am in Bangalore, and once in a while I used to keep traveling up and down, but it just did not work out. Things at work started getting busy here, and it was really hard for me to spend the kind of time that I was able to spend when I was volunteering. I mean, it was hard for me. It was if it was hard for me, it was much harder for them, because they had like a bunch of computers and they have no idea how to go about it, and they're kind of stuck. When they're giving service, they have to actually start using their laptops, and it's just not working. Eventually, they found out some way or engaged with somebody locally to make sure that things are working fine. But like the kind of the experience the learning I took from there is that you cannot promise anybody that you'll be there for them forever. So that was the first time I had ever gotten to any kind of a volunteering activity, and I thought I was just stupid. But unfortunately, I was not the only one, and which is why I'm bringing it up here. So the company that I joined had a chairman who essentially wanted to do social justice everywhere. So he was kind of building systems for a lot of NGOs everywhere, and a lot of them for much lower cost or for free and things like that. And I was involved in one such project, and we went there, met the NGO, came back, and at that time he kind of told me the statement: if we're in this, we're going to be in this for life. And that's when I remembered my previous experience in 2010, and it's the same thing happening all over again. At that point, it was different because this was like a person who was running like a 5,000 member software organization. He was like a millionaire. So if he wants, he can support this for like 100 years. He can write a check to support this for 100 years. And I thought maybe things are different. 3 years later, this person was actually good in terms of like where his heart lies and things like that. But eventually he figured out that his passions lie elsewhere, and he kind of sold the company and left. Now, to his credit, I would say that a lot of the NGOs that they were close with are still being funded in some sense. Their software is still being supported by the organization that he left. But at the same time, this thing comes back to me that it's never permanent. One of these days, as somebody who's running your organization, you'll have to take charge of things. Nothing is ever permanent. The same thing happened. Like I was thinking, okay, this is from the IT side, people are ignorant. What about the people who are actually buying or using this software? Which is when I went to like a government, not the Indian government, a different government establishment, and they had so they were running like for all their government hospitals, they had an inventory management system. And there was one guy who was volunteering to create and manage this thing for a long, long time, who was not even from that country. And one fine day, he decided to leave, and the entire inventory management system of that country came crashing down. The learning, nothing is permanent. Now, the second part of the problem that if you're going to start having digital infrastructure in your organization is that we have to know that nothing is ever free. The software that I made for that initial NGO that I worked for, I mean, the software part was free, but again, the maintenance of it, making sure things are working, it costs money. The first part of it, building software, it's insanely costly. If you think about, so this is just an example that I found. WhatsApp, I mean, this is a very rough figure. Obviously, I wouldn't get the details of details of how much WhatsApp would be spending, but looking at a general team size that they have, they should be spending about 75 crores every year just for that core developer salaries. And then you have their huge server farms and you have their support staff and everything. So, I mean, WhatsApp is a very extreme example, but even for normal organizations to start building software, you would find that some get it for much cheaper, but at the same time, the standard of that, the kind of the facilities it provides will also be comparatively lower. The second part of it, maintaining software, it's never free. You have things like annual maintenance contracts, subscription costs, support costs if you're buying something. And if you're getting it for free, or if you're doing the maintenance yourself, you would still have somebody supporting it. Hardware failures, if you have like 10 laptops, imagine that one of them will go bad in a year and you'll have to plan for like buying that additional laptop for the next year. You might have situations where you have new staff members coming in and you'll have new hardware requirements that will come. If you're hosting somewhere, you'll need to pay some kind of a monthly fee. You'll have to think about salaries if you have new people that you need to be hiring. So it's not free, obviously. All I'm saying is that you need to make sure or plan for these things ahead of time. And obviously the one thing, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would actually understand the first and second parts, but the third part is something that I've not seen a lot of people coming from an NGO background understand. It's that you would be running a system fine, but one fine day you'll actually see something and you'll want to change a process. And now changing a process is it could be very, very simple. You might say, okay, now onwards in my monthly meeting, I need to see this new number so that we can track our things perfectly. That one number would actually mean one new report, which actually would mean going back to your software provider and asking them to add it somewhere, which may or may not be complex depending on what you're going to ask. You would have situations where you're just going to start a new program. I'm running a TB program. I want to start a new nutrition program along with it. It's a very straightforward, it could be a very straightforward thing from your program running perspective. It might be almost nothing. From a software perspective, it does mean a change to the core software, which means that it is something that you'll have to plan ahead of time. So these are things you would have to start thinking about when you want to start your digital transformation journey. The third problem is that it's almost never about technology. You would have your peers within your organization who might not believe that this will solve a problem. Your staff might not think that it solves a problem at all. They might think that it's just adding more work. Some might think that they're just too old to be starting to use computers. And it could be true that the solution itself might not solve all the problems you have. You have some of them, you have some that are not solved, and you'll have no idea how to tick those problems that are not solved. Sometimes you just leave them around. Sometimes it might be just too costly to solve, so you might just not worry about it. But these are the kind of things that will come to you, and we'll have to acknowledge that these things happen. The other one is slightly different. Your vendor or your software provider, they will have a language of their own, and they'll talk about things like servers, replication. They could even talk about like the domain that you're working on in a very different sense. Like for example, somebody in Avni, in the software, we have something called an encounter. Now, this might mean absolutely nothing to the person who's using the software, but what we really mean is like a visit of a person between two people. So there is this kind of domain language, and it often comes as a problem when you communicate with the person who's giving you the software. Now, given these problems, what are the different things that you can actually take care of? The first thing is when you choosing your solution provider. The first thing you'd be looking for is whether you're looking for a technology partner. Like, I want to go on this technology journey. I want to partner with a certain organization who can give me advice on what to do. And this could be like buying, you want to go buy something from here. You want to go, we'll build this one small piece of software for you. A lot of these things, if you're with a technology partner, what happens is you're in a long-term relationship, which means that your technology partner would understand what you are into. They would understand what problems you face. And sometimes they might even figure out without you telling the problems that you're facing and try to fix them. Now, you could also figure out that, no, I really know the exact technology requirements of my organization. I just want somebody to just implement that software for me. Now, these are two different mindsets, and you would have to think in advance of what kind of a person that you want to actually be talking to. I'm not leaning towards one or the other, but that's a decision that as a technology, as a organization like lead, you would have to take care of. Irrespective of what kind of a person you're dealing with, you would obviously have to understand the basics of how long they've been in business. Are they making enough money out of the software they sell? Because if they don't make enough money out of the software they sell, maybe 1 year later, they'll just shut down and all the software that we purchase from them will start becoming useless. So you can ask them what they would do if they really shut down. And if you're talking to a volunteer, you would need to understand like how long they intend to provide support, because it's not just your software. It's like once your software is given, you'll need to figure out how to run them. Or either you can have the volunteer do it, or you could figure out somebody else who can help you support it. And then obviously that once that initial choosing part is over, you'll have to, like, once you have the software, buy the software, or you'll have to manage your relationship with your solution provider. You have to make sure that your solution provider, you have to understand how they manage outages, support, any kind of request that you give. How are you tracking these things? The best thing I've seen in a lot of organizations is they earmark one person. I mean, the places where it really works, they just earmark one person who makes sure that they talk to the software provider in their language, they track all the requests that they've made, make sure that they're delivering on time, and conveys changes back to the organization as well. Like if there is a certain process that needs to happen, they talk to the software provider and tell them, okay, this is what you need to do. And they ask, okay, how long it will take? 3 months? Okay, fine. In that 3 months, they come back and talk to their counterpart saying, okay, this is going to take 3 months. And in the meanwhile, this is what we're going to do. So that kind of a person who can manage the process of your organization and deal with the changes in software. That's the kind of role that you might want to start thinking about when you embark on your digital transformation journey. Now comes the part of choosing the software. The first thing obviously you'd be thinking about is whether you're going to purchase a product or you're going to build this for yourself. Now, what is a product? A product is a piece of software that's being used by multiple people. It could be provided by just one organization. It could be sold by multiple organizations. It can be closed source or open source. There are multiple different variations over there. This one variation which I really wanted to talk about, one is off-the-shelf software. Things like Microsoft Office, you just buy it and forget about it. You don't talk to Microsoft if you have any problems with your Microsoft Word not opening up. You paid the money, you get it, and you figure out a way to fix it. The same thing with WhatsApp, Gmail, Zoho. And then you have these things called domain platforms. Now, what these people do is, if you are in a domain and you might, so these kind of software provide a bit more domain level kind of solution. Like I want to run a website, there's a website solution called WordPress. I want to collect data from people. There are data collection tools like DHIS2, Avni, Comcare, Kobokal. There are specific systems for library management, hospital information, learning management, and things like that. Now, what's the difference between this and off-the-shelf software? The first thing is that there's a lot of configuration that you can do to make sure that it aligns to your own process. And what that means is that you'll need a specialist to help implement that for you. Now, for most purposes of NGOs, right, these kind of domain platforms are things that you would want to keep an eye on. What's the difference between getting one of these products or building custom? The first thing is, obviously, if it's a product, right, the cost is shared among the customers, whether it's a for-profit kind of a thing, whether it's open source, it doesn't really matter. The cost essentially gets shared amongst all the customers. And the more customers you have, the lesser the cost of each new of the product itself. Whereas if it's custom, you pay all of it. And the difference is like an order of magnitude difference. You could have like the software that we provide, Avni itself, like Avni or whatever it is, you could easily like have like crores of. You saw the WhatsApp example, right? Nobody would be able to buy WhatsApp if they're saying that you need to pay so many crores every month. But at the same time, right now, we are all able to do it because the cost is kind of spread across all the customers. The second one is survival. The survival of the software, it depends on how many people adopt it, right? So if you have like 100 people adopting this piece of software, then obviously it will stay on for a few years and you don't have to worry about the life so much. Whereas if it's custom, you'll have to make sure that remember the maintenance and the enhancements part that you'll need to worry about when you have software. If it's custom, you'll have to make sure that you will have to make sure that you pay for all of it, or maybe live without it. I mean, that's a choice you can always make. On the downside, if it's a product, it might not meet all your needs. It might meet 80% or 90% of your needs at a much lower cost. For the rest of it, it will be very costly. It might be prohibitively costly or sometimes even not possible to do. Whereas if it's custom, it's always built to fit your needs. So every one of your requirements get fulfilled. If you're doing something that's really flashy, that needs to have like a lot of interaction and it doesn't look like anything that you've ever seen in a product, then maybe going custom is the way to go. And if it's that important for your like for the digital transformation that you are interested in. If it's a product, the quality of software is known. It can either be good, it can either be bad. If it's custom, you're paying somebody to build a piece of software for you. There is a risk that it could either be good or it could turn out to be really bad. And that's a risk you would have to know ahead of time. If it's a product, there's a possibility of upgrades. You get free features because somebody else asked for it. If it's custom, you'll have to decide what features you need. There's a really nice article which is at the bottom of the slide that one of my colleagues, Vivek, has written about product versus custom. I'd urge you to actually go read it. I'll send the presentation once this is done. Again, choosing the software. We talked about the product versus custom kind of a debate. If you're choosing a product, then you definitely need to look at the number of people using the software. You could be in like a product which has just 1 or 2 customers, and that doesn't really help elongate the life of that software. You can look for number of vendors who are familiar with the software. Like if one person cannot support it, you could actually go to another person. There are some kinds of things like WordPress, things like all these domain software, right? They kind of have multiple people who can help you with implementation. You should probably look at the product roadmaps. There could be something that you don't find here, but it could come like 6 months down the line. So those are things that you should be looking at if you're choosing a product. And no matter whether you choose a product or a custom solution or whatever, you have to make sure that your data is not locked in. Whatever software is being provided, you have to find some way to extract a spreadsheet out of it. And that's something that you have to very critically look at, whatever the piece of software you're trying to use, because data is probably the first or second most important piece of whatever software that you'll be using. Obviously, there is this experience, there's the process enhancement that it does and everything, but the like eventually you're storing this data for using it for something else. So we should never lose sight of that. The other thing you should look for is look for freedom. Like, for example, you could get a piece of software, but for every single change, you might need to go back to your software provider for changes. Things like basic configuration, changing something here and there, adding users, how to pull data out, are there reports available? So these are the kind of things that you would want. The problem with going to a software provider and getting it done is, one is obviously the cost, but more than the cost, it's more of a friction. And when you're running a system, you would want to have as little friction as possible. If I want something done, I want to be able to do it as fast as possible. There's a new person coming in, he's joined, I want to just add a user and move on with it. I don't want to make sure that I raise a ticket with somebody and that person looks at that ticket, has like a 24-hour turnaround time, and then gets it and maybe gets it late. At least for very simple things, you should make sure that those facilities are available. The other thing you could think of is to hire an in-house tech person. I can give you an example of a hospital where we implemented Avni. So we were really tied to implementers. We had like quite a few implementers here, and they were tied for cash. So what we thought was, like, there was this one tech person who was sitting in the hospital. So we said, why don't you actually configure this whole thing for your hospital? And this person, we kind of gave him like some hints of how to do this, and he quickly picked it up and actually got it implemented for the hospital. And it was a win-win for us, because for us, we didn't have the bandwidth to do it, and for the hospital, they didn't have the money to do it. So both of us kind of gained out of this whole experience. We were actually thinking, like, if every company has, and the other thing about this person is, right, he's not just running this one software, he's actually taking care of a lot of other pieces of software that is running in his hospital. And because he's very close to the people in the hospital, right, a lot of things actually keep happening. Like, for example, if the doctor wants to know what is going on with a certain thing, he can just pull up a report very quickly, and it requires some technical skills which he has, and that kind of helps the hospital a lot, because they can move forward in their process much faster. And this is one organization, this hospital in Gurloor, where I've seen this happen. There's also this other hospital in Chhattisgarh that I've seen where this thing kind of works very well. Very simple things like network outages, you get very quick turnaround times if you have somebody in-house. So if you have a chance, always think about having somebody in-house who can do these really simple things. It could even be you, if you could take care, but most probably people who are running the organization usually have like 10 other people to talk to, and would not be able to like get things done this fast. A special mention about mobile apps. Now, mobile application, this is also a pattern that I've seen with a lot of organizations, is that they want a certain piece of information, like nutrition for TB or anything at all, which they want to disseminate to people. Now, if you want to disseminate information to people, usually a mobile app is a very bad idea. And what is the reason? The first is that your cost per install. There's like, in like typical app terms, there is something called a cost per install. You would essentially, in India, I think the rate is something like 40 rupees. Like, that's the kind of money that you would be required to put in for every install of your software. And this is you might be paying it to marketing agencies, you might be doing something else, you might be running a show, but that's the kind of cost that people typically save when they're using mobile apps. And usually we are not, like, that kind of turns out to be prohibitively costly. The other is that the kind of information that you want to disseminate might not be what I want to get. Like, in my phone, the only things I have are Gmail, Twitter, and maybe a couple of games. I just don't install anything else at all. and a lot of people have space constraints because of which they wouldn't install anything at all. But it's mostly messaging, social media, and things that are really important for you that you would install an app. What you could do instead is create communities: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Push content to phones. You have these ways where you can push things to WhatsApp, Telegram. You can push, if you can target the people to whom you want to disseminate the information, these are like the best channels to actually push things through, rather than trying to like create a walled garden. You always try to use existing channels over creating a new channel. Now, there are some things that I would take out of it, things like building a website. A website is like an address that you will have on the internet, so you would probably not want to like miss out on that. Just have a plain website. If you're in the business of actually publishing information, maybe have a placeholder in your website for the information that you publish, like if you're publishing papers and things like that. But if somebody were to actually come look at it, they might actually go look at Google Scholar. You have a much better chance of getting noticed in Google Scholar rather than in your website, unless you're actually giving out the link to people for looking at it. Bring your allies closer. Now, this is one place that you really have to be careful about, because we are in this digital journey together, and that's a feeling that everybody in your organization needs to feel. You have to get buy-in from everybody, people like your peers, as well as the people who are actually going to use your system. Make sure that you have sufficient training for everybody. Everybody really understands. There are some really good training techniques that I've seen people do. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about it, but you definitely need to show the benefits of your digitization journey to keep everybody interested. And you need to talk to everybody to understand their pain points and work to fix them. And last but not the least, it's very easy to forget once you start this journey, right? You might forget what you actually started it for. So always like keep that. There was this one thing when in a hospital that we said, we actually started with, why are we doing this? And the founder of the NGOs gave us like 3 things, and we made sure that every single piece of software that we deliver, it has to take one of those 3 things. And if it doesn't, then we will not build it. So that kind of helped us a lot in deciding what kind of features we want to put in a piece of software to build. But as somebody who's running an organization, it would be good if you can have some clear success metrics. It need not be absolutely numerical. It could even be it could be subjective as well, but you need to know what you want to be looking at 6 months from now when this is on the field, and keep looking at it and make sure that it actually makes sense at the end, and we've gotten to a much better place than before. With that, I end my speech. Thank you a lot for listening.
Thank you, Vinay. There have been a few questions, or actually not so much questions, but actually some experiences, I would say, of people trying to implement systems, move from platforms like going from Windows to Linux or something like that, and some experiences that how difficult it can be, and sometimes those things can come in the roadblocks for change and so on. So I mean, I know we don't have that much time, we have but I want to definitely sort of thank you for bringing all these various points. This is this is a fairly big thing to sort of digest in a half an hour uh, um, time slot. So you have covered a lot of you've covered a lot of points. I'm hoping that we can share the presentation with people, because I think it will have, there's a lot of, and of course the link that you mentioned, the helpful article, we would like to share it with the attendees so that they can refer to it and possibly even get back if they want to have conversations with you or more questions at a later point. Is that okay?
Sure, I just sent the link of the presentation, so it's open for sharing.
Wonderful, excellent. Thank you so much. So that's great. So I clearly any bringing any software solution into any organization is a non-trivial exercise. Uh, Technology is only one portion of it. There's a significant portion that's related to people, processes, longevity of the organization, of the product which is to be used, who's going to support it, and all that. And one trap that a lot of us fall into several times is to count on volunteers to get things done. Particularly, it's happens in a lot of NGOs that you look for somebody who can spare during spare time do something, and more often than not things don't go well, uh, because the priorities are different. There's not enough that time, and like you gave your example of 2010. When the person goes somewhere else, it's that much harder for the organizations to connect and keep things running. So and increasingly this is an important topic for a lot of organizations that are growing, scaling up, trying to reach more people, serve more people, and so on, and trying to use technology. So I think at least somewhere we have an opportunity to step back, look at this thing. What are some of the important contributors that will help me make the right decision? So I want to thank you once again, Vinay, for sharing this thing. We will share this slide deck with everyone, and whatever, and the links as well. And hopefully this will give us some direction in which to think when we think about what software, what systems we need to bring into our work, and how we can make the right choices. So thanks once again. Uh, to bring this session to a close, this session, as you all know, was primarily focused on trying to understand the role technology is playing in the sector and in our organizations. Uh, what Vinay spoke about clearly has to do with we as people who are within an organization trying to implement systems and solutions and so on, and how we can do that. But other two examples that we looked at, Gaurav talking about the role of data and how we as citizens can work with governments, local, state, central, and so on, to engage with them, use public data to see how we can make sense of what's going on, to see how we can have a better, more useful conversation. And for many of us who have been very proud of the fact that Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo got uh, a Nobel recently, we know that how important uh, data-based, data-driven validations, data-driven approaches can help us build better systems and solutions and policy and so on. So that was sort of the theme of Gaurav's talk, and we looked at uh, the technology which many people are experimenting with, both in the particularly in the corporate world, and sometimes now also in some of the development sector, and that is the use of blockchain. Complicated technology, no doubt. I mean, we would have heard from Pratap's presentation, we know how difficult it is to understand, but hopefully tomorrow we'll get a more practical view of how some of the organizations are actually doing it. And that brings me to what's happening tomorrow. Tomorrow we have three speakers talking about some very interesting um, experiments, interesting transformations, some progressive approaches that they have taken, their organizations have taken in making some big change happen. So we have Mr. Mayank Gandhi, who's going to be talking about the experience he and his team have had working in a very drought-prone area of Maharashtra, and what kind of 360 transformation they're doing, what kind of a template that they are creating, which then can be used in other parts of India and so on. So that is one part. Then we have Vilas Shinde from Sahyadri Farmer Producer Company, one of the biggest in the country. What has made their FPC more successful than others? What are some of the lessons they've learned? And then him, Vilas Shinde, as well as Gaurav Somanshi are going to talk about how blockchain has actually been used in Sahyadri which is one of India's largest grape exporters to the West, and how blockchain is actually helping them become a very reliable supplier of high quality agriculture produce to the world market. So tomorrow is going to be the fourth day of the conference. I invite you to come back tomorrow 6 p.m. to listen to these invited speakers tomorrow. And with that, we will bring today's session to a close. We've gone a little bit over time, but okay, I want to thank the speakers as well as attendees uh, for being with us and staying till the end. Uh, Again, an appeal to anybody who is not connected yet with Stars. Please consider becoming an affiliate. Join the network. Share your information. Share information about what you are doing, how you may be able to help others in this network, and what kind of help you might want from others. The idea of the network is to help each other. So, with that, I want to thank everyone and have a good evening to you all, and see you all tomorrow. Thank you.